In a world ruled by kings and chaos, rose a queen whose silence held more power than 1,000 swords. Elizabeth wasn't just a monarch, she was a mystery cloaked in velvet and fire. Tonight, as the world grows quiet and your pillow welcomes you into stillness, we'll drift through the corridors of her reign. From her fragile beginnings to her iron rule, every step reveals the solitude behind the crown. Let history tuck you in with the whispers of the Virgin Queen's life. If stories of royal intrigue, quiet strength, and the forgotten corners of history help ease your restless night's dust, this channel is your sanctuary. Subscribe and hit the bell icon to drift into another life with every bedtime tale. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? It's always amazing to see how far our quiet little stories are reaching. You find yourself in the year 1536, watching as servants scurry through the dim corridors of a once grand household. The tapestries have grown threadbare, the silver plate has been removed, and an air of uncertainty hangs over everything like morning mist. This is no ordinary household in decline. This is the residence of a 2-year-old girl who, until recently, was Princess Elizabeth of England. Now she is simply Lady Elizabeth, a bastard child whose very existence has become an inconvenience to her father, King Henry VIII. The transformation happened with brutal swiftness. One day, Elizabeth was the cherished heir to the throne, dressed in cloth of gold and attended by dozens of servants. The next, her mother Anne Boleyn was dead, her parents' marriage declared null and void, and Elizabeth herself stripped of her royal title. On the Tudor Trail tells us that by August 1536, her governess Margaret Bryan was writing desperate letters to Thomas Cromwell, describing the disorder that had descended upon the princess's household. The king had stopped paying those in Elizabeth's service and ceased providing household supplies. You witness the daily humiliation of a royal child reduced to near poverty. Bryan's letters paint a stark picture. Elizabeth has neither gown nor kirtle, nor petticoat, nor linen for smock. Picture this: a toddler who once wore miniature versions of court dress, now having to make do with whatever scraps her devoted servants could find or afford from their own meagre resources. The irony was bitter. Henry VIII, who had moved heaven and earth to divorce Catherine of Aragon and marry Anne Boleyn in hopes of securing a male heir, had now rendered his own daughter destitute to erase any reminder of his second marriage. The steep household itself reflects this abandonment. Where once dozens of servants attended to every need of the princess, now a skeleton staff struggles to maintain basic dignity. The great hall that once echoed with the sounds of courtly life sits mostly empty. Meals are simple affairs: porridge, bread, perhaps some preserved meat when available. The elaborate ceremonies that typically surrounded royal children have vanished entirely. No longer does anyone kneel when Elizabeth enters a room. No longer are her meals served on silver plate with the requisite tastings for poison. The daily rituals that would have defined her as royal have simply evaporated. Yet, in this reduced state, you observe something remarkable beginning to form. The very people who could have abandoned their posts, Margaret Bryan, Blanche Parry, and later Catherine Champernowne, instead become fiercely protective of this displaced child. They understand that they are witnessing history being written in real time, and their charge, despite her current circumstances, might yet have a future. Bryan's persistent letters to Cromwell begging for basic necessities show a determination that goes beyond mere duty. These women are fighting for Elizabeth's survival, both physical and political. The tedious nature of their daily existence cannot be overstated. Bryan must account for every penny spent, justify every purchase, and constantly remind the king's men that Elizabeth, though bastardized, remains Henry's daughter. The household records from this period revealed the mind-numbing bureaucracy of royal poverty. Requests for new shifts for the child, for food, for firewood, all must be documented, submitted, and often rejected or ignored. The very act of keeping Elizabeth clothed and fed becomes an exercise in diplomatic negotiation. As autumn turns to winter in 1536, you see the household settling into its new, diminished reality. The child Elizabeth, too young to fully understand the political machinations that have upended her life, adapts with the resilience of youth. She learns to walk quietly through rooms that once celebrated her presence. She grows accustomed to simple clothes and simple meals. Most importantly, she bonds deeply with the women who chose to stay with her when abandoning their posts would have been the safer choice. The boring, repetitive nature of their days, the same meager breakfast, the same simple lessons, the same careful allocation of resources creates a strange kind of stability. Brian establishes routines that give structure to Elizabeth's world, even as the larger structure of royal privilege crumbles around her. Morning prayers, basic lessons in reading and deportment, walks in the reduced gardens, evening prayers. These mundane activities become the scaffolding upon which Elizabeth's character begins to form. What emerges from this period of disgrace is not a broken child, but one who learns early that security is fragile, that loyalty is precious, and that survival often depends on the kindness of those society considers lesser. The women who tend to her during these months are not noble-born ladies, but career servants who understand the practical aspects of life. From them, Elizabeth absorbs lessons in resourcefulness, in making do with little, in maintaining dignity, even when circumstances strip away external markers of worth. As 1536 draws to a close, the household has found its rhythm in this new reality. Elizabeth, approaching her third birthday, chatters freely with her caregivers in their native English rather than the formal French that would have dominated her early vocabulary as a princess. She helps with small household tasks, learns to amuse herself with simple toys rather than elaborate court entertainments, and begins to show the quick intelligence that will later astonish her tutors. But questions linger in the air of this reduced household. Will the king remember he has a daughter? Will Elizabeth's circumstances improve, or will she remain forever in this liminal space between royalty and commoner? The servants exchange worried glances when they think the child isn't watching. They know that Henry's attention can be as dangerous as his neglect, and they wonder what fate awaits the girl who was once heir to England's throne. The year has been a masterclass in the arbitrary nature of power, and Elizabeth, though too young to understand it intellectually, is absorbing these lessons at a cellular level. She is learning that titles can be stripped away overnight, that love can be declared void by decree, and that the only truly reliable sources of security are the quiet competence and fierce loyalty of people who choose to stand by you when they have every reason to walk away. These are not the usual lessons of a royal childhood, but they will prove far more valuable than any traditional princess's education in the challenges that lie ahead. Story 1. The Bastard. Princess by 1537, the household of Lady Elizabeth had evolved into something resembling normalcy, though it remained a pale shadow of what a royal princess might expect. On the Tudor Trail describes how Margaret Bryan's relentless advocacy had succeeded in convincing the king to grant much of what she requested. Elizabeth's household was now smaller, and her standard of living greatly reduced from when she was a legitimate princess, but at least she was no longer neglected. You observe the tedious daily routine that has emerged from this bureaucratic victory. Each morning, begins with the same careful accounting that has become the hallmark of Elizabeth's reduced circumstances. Servants count linens, measure out portions of food, and maintain meticulous records of every expenditure. Where a royal household might operate with generous abundance, Elizabeth's operates with the precision of a merchant's ledger. Every candle, every piece of soap, every yard of fabric must be justified to the king's treasury. The most significant change comes with the transfer of Margaret Bryan to Prince Edward's service. This reshuffling of personnel reflects the hard realities of Tudor court life. Even the most devoted servants must follow opportunities for advancement, and caring for the legitimate heir takes precedence over caring for the bastard daughter. But fate provides Elizabeth with two remarkable women who will shape her development far more profoundly than any princess's traditional governors. Blanche Parry, who had been Elizabeth's cradle rocker and now takes on broader household duties, and Catherine Champernowne, later known as Cat Ashley, who becomes Elizabeth's governess and surrogate mother. The establishment of this new household dynamic reveals the boring but crucial work of child-rearing in the 16th century. Champernowne begins Elizabeth's formal education with the painstaking work of teaching her to read and write. You witness hours upon hours of letter formation, the child's small hand guided again and again over slate and parchment. The process is repetitive and often frustrating, the same letters traced hundreds of times until muscle memory takes over. Unlike the elaborate tutoring that might have been arranged for an acknowledged princess, this education happens in the quiet of domestic spaces, around kitchen tables and in small chambers warmed by single fires. The curriculum itself reflects the practical realities of Elizabeth's situation. Champernowne teaches basic manners and deportment, but these lessons focus on the kind of comportment that will serve Elizabeth regardless of her eventual station in life. She learns to curtsy properly, to hold her head high despite circumstances, to speak clearly and confidently, but she also learns to darn stockings, to help with simple household tasks, and to be gracious to servants, lessons that acknowledge the uncertainty of her future. Language instruction begins early and proceeds with methodical thoroughness. On the Tudor trail, notes that modern studies show the younger a child is when they learn a second language, the easier it is for them to retain additional ones. Champernowne introduces Elizabeth to Latin through the tedious but effective method of rote memorization. The child spends hours each day reciting Latin prayers, Latin phrases, Latin vocabulary. The same words repeated endlessly until they become as natural as breathing. This linguistic foundation proves crucial when Elizabeth's circumstances begin to improve. In 1537, Dr. Richard Cox, Provost of Eton College, begins tutoring Prince Edward. Elizabeth, increasingly included in her half-brother's household activities, benefits from overhearing these more advanced lessons. You watch as the child positions herself within earshot of Edward's tutorials, absorbing mathematical concepts, historical narratives, and theological discussions intended for the future king. The gradual expansion of Elizabeth's educational opportunities reflects the complex political calculus surrounding her status. Henry the Faith may have bastardized her, but he has not completely written her off. The king's attitude toward his daughter fluctuates with his moods, his marriages, and his ongoing concerns about the succession. Sometimes he ignores her completely. Sometimes he summons her to court for specific occasions. Sometimes he makes grand gestures of paternal affection before returning to indifference. These fluctuations create a wearing pattern of raised and dashed hopes for everyone in Elizabeth's household. Servants never know from week to week whether their mistress will be summoned to court, provided with new privileges, or returned to obscurity. The uncertainty requires constant adaptation. Lessons must be structured to be easily interrupted. or relocated. Household routines must be flexible enough to accommodate sudden changes in circumstance. Even the child's clothing must strike a balance between the dignity appropriate to her royal blood and the modesty suitable to her bastard status. As 1538 unfolds, you witness the exhausting work of maintaining Elizabeth's education despite these constraints. Champernowne has expanded the curriculum to include French, which Elizabeth learns through the same methodical repetition that characterizes all her studies. Hours each day are devoted to pronunciation exercises, vocabulary drills, and simple conversations. The governess creates elaborate games to make the learning engaging, but the foundation remains repetitive practice. Dance instruction provides one of the few opportunities for genuine joy in Elizabeth's routine. Champernowne had been trained in the court dances that form an essential part of any noblewoman's education, and she passes these skills to Elizabeth through long afternoon sessions in whatever space can be cleared for the purpose. The child learns the intricate steps of galliards, pavanes, and allemandes. Each dance requires precise footwork, graceful arm movements, and perfect timing. The repetitive nature of dance instruction, the same steps practiced again and again until they become instinctive, mirrors the methodical approach to all of Elizabeth's education. The household's relationship with music reflects the reduced but still distinctly royal nature of Elizabeth's upbringing. Unlike her half-sister Mary, who had access to the finest court musicians, Elizabeth learns music through the more modest resources available to her household. She begins with simple songs, usually religious in nature, learning to read musical notation through the same patient repetition that characterizes her other studies. A small virginal, a keyboard instrument, provides her first formal musical education, its limited range requiring her to master the basics thoroughly before moving to more complex pieces. As winter approaches in 1538, the household has settled into rhythms that will shape Elizabeth's development for years to come. Her days follow a pattern that emphasizes learning, discipline, and the kind of practical wisdom that comes from living with uncertainty. Morning prayers are followed by lessons in reading and writing, then language instruction, then music or dance, then afternoon walks when weather permits, then evening lessons in deportment and basic mathematics. The boring regularity of this routine masks its profound importance in shaping Elizabeth's character. Unlike the elaborate ceremonies and constant entertainments that typically surround royal children, Elizabeth's education emphasizes substance over spectacle. She learns to find satisfaction in mastery rather than in external validation. She develops the kind of intellectual curiosity that can sustain itself without elaborate resources. Most importantly, she learns to value the people who choose to invest in her development despite having no guarantee of future reward. But even as this routine provides stability, questions about Elizabeth's future continue to permeate the household atmosphere. Will she marry a minor nobleman and disappear into domestic obscurity? Will she be restored to the succession if Henry fails to produce additional male heirs? Will she spend her entire life in this strange middle ground between royalty and commoner? These uncertainties hang over every lesson, every plan, every investment in her development. The very act of educating her thoroughly implies hope for a significant future, but no one dares voice such hopes too explicitly. The year ends with Elizabeth approaching her 5th birthday, already showing signs of the formidable intelligence that will later astonish Europe. But for now, she remains a child whose days are defined by the patient, repetitive work of learning, work made more precious by the uncertain circumstances under which it takes place. The year 1543 brings a transformation that will reshape Elizabeth's world once again, though like most changes in her young life, it begins with the tedious machinery of royal matrimony grinding slowly into motion. You witness the elaborate preparations for Henry VIII's 6th marriage, to Catherine Parr, a ceremony that seems to happen around Elizabeth rather than including her. The child, now nearly 10 years old, has learned to watch these great events. From the margins, understanding that her own fate often hangs on the outcomes of dramas in which she plays no direct part. Catherine Parr's influence on Elizabeth's education represents a revolution disguised as gradual reform. On the Tudor trail, details how the new Queen Dowager brings a humanist approach to learning that transforms Elizabeth's daily routine from basic instruction to sophisticated intellectual development. But this transformation happens slowly, through the accumulation of small changes that only become apparent when viewed across months and years. The most immediate change is the expansion of Elizabeth's household. Where she had grown accustomed to the intimate scale of her reduced circumstances, she now finds herself part of a larger educational enterprise centered around Prince Edward, but encompassing all of Henry's children. The logistics of this expansion require constant adjustment. Schedules must be coordinated between multiple tutors and multiple students. Resources must be allocated to support more complex curricula. Even the physical spaces must be reorganized to accommodate group lessons and individual instruction. You observe the careful choreography required to integrate Elizabeth into Prince Edward's educational program without emphasizing the disparity in their official status. Edward remains the acknowledged heir, the future king around whom all planning revolves. Elizabeth participates in his lessons as a privilege, not a right. This distinction shapes every interaction, from the order in which students are acknowledged to the deference shown to their respective opinions. The daily reminder of her secondary status becomes part of Elizabeth's education in the realities of power. The arrival of new tutors brings a level of intellectual rigor that Elizabeth has never before experienced. In early 1544, Sir John Cheke, Regius Professor of Greek at Cambridge, takes over Prince Edward's instruction, bringing with him Roger Ascham and Anthony Cook. These men represent the finest humanist education available in England, and their presence transforms the household's academic atmosphere. But their attention focuses primarily on Edward, leaving Elizabeth to benefit from their proximity rather than their direct instruction. The solution comes with the appointment of William Grindal as Elizabeth's personal tutor. Grindal, also a Greek scholar and former pupil of Ascham, brings the same rigorous approach to Elizabeth's education that the more famous scholars apply to Edward's. But working with Elizabeth presents unique challenges. Her lessons must be substantial, enough to develop her considerable abilities while remaining appropriately modest for her bastard status. The curriculum Grindal develops walks this careful line through an emphasis on languages and classical literature, rather than the political and military studies considered essential for future rulers. The daily routine that emerges under Grindal's guidance reveals the painstaking nature of serious education in the 16th century. Each morning begins with prayers in Latin, not merely recited, but analyzed for grammatical structure and theological content. Elizabeth translates passages from Latin to English and back again, developing the kind of linguistic facility that will later astonish foreign ambassadors. The process is methodical and often tedious. The same passages work through repeatedly until every nuance of meaning and structure becomes clear. Greek instruction follows a similar pattern of methodical progression. Elizabeth begins with the Greek alphabet, spending weeks on letter formation until her hand moves confidently across the page. Basic vocabulary comes next, then simple sentences, then increasingly complex passages. Grindal introduces her to the Greek New Testament, requiring her to work through passages word by word, consulting lexicons and commentaries to understand both literal meaning and theological significance. The process is slow and often frustrating, but it builds the kind of thorough linguistic foundation that will serve Elizabeth throughout her life. The afternoon hours typically focus on French and Italian, languages considered essential for any noblewoman who might need to navigate international marriage negotiations. Elizabeth's facility with languages continues to astonish her instructors. She absorbs new vocabulary with remarkable speed and develops an ear for pronunciation that allows her to speak without the heavy English accent that marks most of her contemporaries as foreigners. But even natural ability requires constant practice. You watch as she spends hours each day in conversation with French-speaking members of the household, forcing herself to think and respond in the target language. Music instruction takes on new sophistication under Catherine Parr's influence. Elizabeth progresses from simple songs to complex polyphonic pieces that require her to understand harmonic relationships and rhythmic structures. The virginal lessons expand to include lute and basic instruction in vocal techniques. Music becomes not merely an accomplishment but a genuine intellectual pursuit, with Elizabeth learning to read and analyze musical compositions as systematically as she approaches literary texts. The integration of physical education into Elizabeth's routine reflects the humanist belief in developing both mind and body. Dance instruction becomes more sophisticated, with Elizabeth learning the complex court dances that will be essential if she ever takes her place in formal society. But she also receives instruction in riding, an essential skill for anyone of noble birth. The hours spent in the saddle, learning to control a horse while maintaining perfect posture and grace, represent another form of the patient, repetitive practice that characterizes all aspects of her education. Religious instruction takes on particular importance given the complex theological climate of Henry's England. Elizabeth must master not only the basic tenets of Christianity, but also the specific positions that distinguish the English Church from both Roman Catholicism and continental Protestantism. The theological distinctions might seem abstract, but Elizabeth's future depends on her ability to navigate these differences diplomatically. She spends hours memorizing and analyzing religious texts, learning to distinguish between essential beliefs and negotiable practices. The household routine that emerges by 1545 represents a delicate balance between intellectual rigor and political caution. Elizabeth's education has become genuinely impressive. She can converse in Latin, Greek, French, and Italian. She can analyze complex theological and philosophical texts. She can perform sophisticated musical compositions. She can conduct herself with grace in formal settings. But all of this learning happens within carefully maintained boundaries that never quite acknowledge her potential as a future ruler. The question that hangs over all of this careful education becomes more pressing. As Elizabeth approaches adolescence, what is all this learning for? If she remains permanently bastardized, her scholarly accomplishments might simply make her a more attractive candidate for marriage to a foreign prince or English nobleman. If she is restored to the succession, her education has prepared her to rule, but no one dares discuss these possibilities explicitly. The household operates on hope and preparation, investing enormous effort in developing Elizabeth's capabilities, while officially acknowledging no particular purpose for that development. As 1545 draws to a close, Elizabeth has become a formidable young scholar whose intellectual abilities rival those of any prince in Europe. But she remains officially a bastard, dependent on her father's changeable moods for her very survival. The contradiction between her extraordinary education and her official insignificance creates a tension that permeates every aspect of her daily life. She has been prepared for greatness while being denied any official path to achieve it, creating the conditions that will later drive her to seize and hold power with the fierce determination of someone who understands how quickly everything can be taken away. The cold April morning of 1580 finds you standing in the shadowed corridors of Whitehall Palace, watching as servants move silently through the darkened bedchambers of Queen Elizabeth I, completing their morning tasks with the reverence due to A great monarch, the fire is lit, warming the cold rooms. Water is heated, ready for the queen to bathe, and her clothes are laid out with the precision of a religious ceremony. You witness the transformation of a sleeping woman into the elaborate construction known as Gloriana, a process so methodical and time-consuming that it defines the very rhythm of court life. As Elizabeth wakes in her private chambers, the first hour of her day unfolds with liturgical precision. Her attendants hurry to her side, dressing her in a simple morning gown and helping her to wash with the heated water that has been prepared since before dawn. These are intimate moments, hidden from the public gaze, where the 46-year-old queen momentarily appears as merely mortal. But even these private preparations follow strict protocols developed over decades of rule. Before doing anything else, Elizabeth walks alone into her personal chapel to pray. This solitary devotion represents one of the few moments in her day when she stands before God without the mediation of ceremony or the observation of courtiers. The chapel itself is modest by royal standards, but it contains the Catholic elements that Elizabeth personally favors, candles and a crucifix that reflect her careful positioning between Protestant doctrine and Catholic aesthetics. Her prayers follow the Anglican liturgy she has helped to establish, but in the privacy of these moments, the theological complexities of her religious settlement give way to personal devotion. The Queen's breakfast provides another glimpse into the careful balance between royal dignity and personal preference that characterizes Elizabeth's daily routine. A small breakfast of bread, butter, and eggs has been laid out for her, accompanied by a cup of small beer, but she touches little of it. This modest appetite, whether a matter of personal inclination or deliberate self-discipline, contrasts sharply with the elaborate feasts that will mark the later hours of her day. You observe the careful attention paid to even these simple foods, the bread baked fresh in the palace kitchens, the butter churned from cream provided by the royal dairy, the eggs collected from birds raised specifically for the royal table. The transition from private person to public sovereign begins with the elaborate dressing ritual that will consume the next 2 hours. To serve the Queen in any capacity is a high honor, and even the simplest of tasks are carried out as quasi-religious observances. The Queen is dressed by her attendants in carefully prescribed layers. First, a loose shirt, followed by a corset, lined with wood that provides the rigid foundation for her silhouette. The process continues with petticoat, farthingale, and elaborate gown, each garment requiring precise adjustment to achieve the desired effect. But it is the application of makeup that truly transforms Elizabeth from woman to icon. She also wears a significant amount of makeup, as she has done since 1562. The white lead and vinegar mixture that creates her stark pallor represents far more than cosmetic enhancement. It creates a mask of majesty that renders her face as formal and stylized as a religious painting. Her face is whitened with a toxic mixture of white lead and vinegar, and then her lips and cheeks are painted with rouge made from egg whites and red dye. The health consequences of this daily ritual have become increasingly apparent over the years. People.com reports that the lead-based makeup has caused hair loss, skin deterioration, and the gradual poisoning that affects her memory and mood. As her skin has deteriorated over the decades, she has compensated by applying ever thicker layers of the toxic ceruse, creating a vicious cycle of damage and concealment. By 1580, the makeup creates a mask-like appearance that both preserves and imprisons her, allowing her to maintain the image of eternal youth while slowly destroying her health. The wig selection represents another crucial element of the royal transformation. Elizabeth's natural hair, damaged by years of lead-based treatments, has long since been supplemented by elaborate wigs that match her original red color. The construction and maintenance of these wigs requires the attention of specialized servants, who understand not only their practical function but their symbolic importance. Each wig must be perfectly positioned, creating the impression of naturally abundant hair, while concealing the ravages of time and toxicity. The selection of jewelry follows its own complex protocols. Elizabeth chooses from an inventory of thousands of pieces, each carrying specific associations and messages. Pearls convey purity and divine favor. Diamonds suggest permanence and strength. Rubies evoke passion and power. The arrangement of these ornaments requires both aesthetic sensibility and political calculation. Today's choices must complement not only her costume, but also the diplomatic messages she intends to convey during the day's audiences. In her hand, she carries a miniature prayer book and a small wristwatch, the latter a gift from Robert Dudley that has become one of her most treasured possessions. These personal items bridge the gap between private woman and public sovereign, reminding her of both spiritual obligations and intimate connections, even as she prepares to assume her role as England's most carefully constructed public figure. The completion of this transformation creates a figure that seems to exist outside normal human limitations. The pale perfection of her face, the rigid geometry of her costume, the calculated arrangement of ornaments, all combine to produce an effect that is more architectural than human. You observe how the women who attend her step back when the process is complete, not merely to admire their work, but in recognition that they have created something larger than life. Her fastidiousness concerning her appearance means that this process takes at least 2 hours, during which the machinery of government effectively pauses. Privy councillors wait in antechambers, foreign ambassadors adjust their schedules, and the entire elaborate structure of Tudor administration accommodates itself to the requirements of royal toilette. The time invested in this daily transformation reflects not vanity but statecraft. Elizabeth understands that her physical presence must support the illusion of divine authority upon which her power ultimately rests. As the final adjustments are made and Elizabeth prepares to emerge from her private chambers, you sense the weight of expectation that surrounds this moment. The woman who entered these chambers 2 hours ago has been replaced by an icon, a carefully constructed symbol of monarchy that will spend the rest of the day performing the complex choreography of royal power. But beneath the layers of silk and lead-based paint, beneath the architectural precision of her costume and the calculated perfection of her appearance, remains a human being whose daily existence requires this extraordinary effort simply to maintain the illusion that she is something more than mortal. The door opens, and Gloriana emerges to begin her reign anew, as she has done every morning for more than 20 years. The daily miracle of monarchy, the transformation of a middle-aged woman into a divine icon, is complete once again, but the cost of this daily resurrection grows heavier with each passing year. The great doors of the presence chamber open with ceremonial deliberation, and you watch as Queen Elizabeth I makes her entrance into the world of formal monarchy. Holding court is an important way in which Elizabeth exercises her royal power. Being seen is an important part of being queen, and the elaborate staging of this daily appearance reflects decades of refined theatrical instinct. Every element of the performance has been calculated to reinforce the mystique of royal authority, from the order in which courtiers arrange themselves to the precise angle at which morning light falls across the throne. The physical space of Whitehall's presence chamber itself tells the story of English monarchy through its accumulated layers of decoration and symbolism. Portraits of Henry VIII dominate the walls, reminding observers of the dynasty's power and ruthlessness. Tapestries depicting biblical scenes of divine justice frame the throne, while the elaborate ceiling bears painted representations of the Tudor rose and other royal symbols. Every surface communicates the message that this space exists outside ordinary reality, that events unfolding here possess significance beyond their immediate practical purpose. The courtiers who attend these daily sessions represent the complex ecology of Tudor court life. You observe how they arrange themselves according to invisible but absolute hierarchies, each person's position in the room reflecting their status in the larger machinery of government. Privy councillors stand closest to the throne, their proximity a visible sign of their access to royal favour. Foreign ambassadors occupy positions that acknowledge their importance while subtly emphasizing their status as outsiders. Lesser nobles, court officials, and favour seekers distribute themselves throughout the remaining space according to complex calculations of precedence and opportunity. The Queen's entrance transforms this carefully arranged assembly into a living tableau of submission and authority. As Elizabeth takes her place on the throne, the entire room performs a choreographed acknowledgement of her supremacy, bows calibrated to reflect each person's relationship to royal power, murmured greetings that follow prescribed formulas, the rustle of silk and velvet as hundreds of people adjust their positions in response to her presence. The moment represents the daily renewal of the social contract that binds together English society, the collective agreement to treat one mortal woman as the embodiment of divine authority. Elizabeth takes counsel on political matters during these morning sessions, but the form this consultation takes bears little resemblance to modern notions of executive decision-making. Each issue requires elaborate presentation with written memoranda that have been prepared by teams of secretaries and reviewed by multiple levels of advisors before reaching the Queen's attention. The process emphasizes form as much as substance. Every document bears appropriate seals and ribbons. Every speaker follows protocols that have been refined over generations of royal service. The Queen's responses to these presentations reveal the careful balance she maintains between accessibility and majesty. She listens carefully to the overtures from foreign ambassadors, but her replies follow diplomatic formulas designed to convey information while preserving maximum flexibility for future negotiation. You observe how she uses silence as a form of communication, allowing pauses to extend until they become meaningful in themselves. Her facial expressions, visible to the entire assembly, become instruments of policy, suggesting favour or displeasure, with the precision of written instructions. The petitions that occupy much of the morning session reflect the extraordinary range of issues that require royal attention in 16th century England. Local magistrates seek guidance on matters of law enforcement. Religious authorities request clarification on points of doctrine. Merchants appeal for trading privileges. Nobles pursue confirmation of land grants. Each request, regardless of its practical significance, receives the same formal treatment: presentation by an appropriately qualified spokesman, consideration by the Queen in consultation with relevant advisors, and a response that balances the specific request against larger concerns of policy and precedence. Between these formal proceedings, Elizabeth engages in the more subtle work of court management that occupies so much of her daily attention. She monitors the complex relationships among her courtiers, noting alliances and rivalries that might affect the larger stability of her government. A word of praise for one favourite, a slight coolness toward another, a strategic question about family connections. These seemingly casual interactions shape the political landscape as surely as formal policy decisions. The Queen's attention to detail in these interpersonal calculations reflects her understanding that successful monarchy depends as much on psychological manipulation as on institutional authority. She remembers birthdays, family events, personal preferences, and past favours with the precision of a diplomat managing a complex negotiation. You watch her deploy this knowledge strategically, offering congratulations that acknowledge both personal achievement and political loyalty, expressing concern for illnesses that reinforces the image of maternal care. for her subjects. The morning's formal business concludes with the ceremonial presentation of documents requiring royal signature or seal. Each paper receives the same careful attention regardless of its significance. Elizabeth reads, or has read to her, every document she signs, asking clarifying questions that demonstrate her engagement with the details of administration. The physical act of signing becomes a performance in itself, with the Queen's careful script creating artifacts that will carry royal authority throughout the realm. As the presence chamber begins to empty, Elizabeth prepares for the carefully orchestrated transition to the next phase of her daily performance. As the day wears on, Elizabeth, followed by her courtiers, moves outside to take air in the palace gardens. This movement represents another calculated element of royal visibility, allowing different groups of courtiers and petitioners to access the Queen in a more informal setting while maintaining the essential structure of royal dignity. The procession to the gardens follows its own protocols, with the Queen's route predetermined and announced so that appropriate crowds can gather. To witness her passage, palace guards clear the way while maintaining an illusion of spontaneity. Ladies in waiting arrange themselves to provide suitable accompaniment without overshadowing the central figure. Even the Queen's pace becomes a matter of careful calculation, slow enough to allow proper observation and acknowledgement, quick enough to maintain the impression of purposeful movement. The gardens themselves have been prepared for royal use through hours of maintenance that remain invisible to casual observers. Paths have been swept, flowers arranged, benches positioned to provide appropriate settings for informal conversation. Gardeners have been instructed to remain available but unobtrusive, ready to answer questions about plants or growing techniques that allow Elizabeth to demonstrate her interest in domestic concerns. The entire environment has been stage-managed to support the illusion of relaxed informality while providing maximum opportunities for the kind of casual encounters that often prove more significant than formal audiences. As Elizabeth emerges into the spring sunlight, the morning's elaborate rituals of transformation and performance give way to a different but equally calculated mode of royal behavior. The gardens offer space for the kind of apparently spontaneous interactions that allow her to demonstrate accessibility while maintaining ultimate control over every encounter. The afternoon will bring its own requirements for performance, but for this moment, the Queen appears to step slightly outside the most rigid constraints of formal ceremony while never abandoning the essential structure of royal authority. The garden conversations that unfold during these afternoon walks reveal Elizabeth's mastery of what might be called informal statecraft. She moves from group to group of waiting courtiers, spending precisely calculated amounts of time with each, asking questions that demonstrate both personal interest and political awareness. A query about someone's estates allows her to gather intelligence about local conditions. An inquiry about family connections helps her map the complex web of relationships that bind together the English nobility. A comment about recent diplomatic news provides opportunities to float trial positions without formal commitment. You observe how the Queen uses the garden setting to create an illusion of intimacy that actually serves highly strategic purposes. The absence of throne and formal seating arrangements suggests equality, but Elizabeth's movement through the space makes clear that she remains the center around which all other activity revolves. Courtiers position themselves along her anticipated route, hoping to catch her attention. Conversations begin and end at her discretion. Even the most casual exchanges follow protocols that acknowledge her supreme authority. The afternoon light begins to fade as Elizabeth completes her circuit of the gardens, and you witness the careful choreography required to transition from this semi-public performance back to the private spaces where the evening's entertainment will be prepared. As the day draws to a close, Elizabeth retires for a brief rest, and, a change of clothes. This interval provides the only genuine break in her daily performance, a few precious moments when she can step completely outside the demanding role of public sovereignty. But even this private interlude serves the larger machinery of royal performance. She is dressed in a new magnificent gown that transforms her appearance for the evening's festivities. Where the morning's costume emphasized dignity and authority appropriate for formal business, the evening's outfit projects magnificence and celebration suitable for entertainment. The change requires another hour of careful attention from her ladies, who refresh her makeup, adjust her wig, and ensure that every element of her appearance meets the standards appropriate for this different mode of royal performance. Tonight, a banquet is held at Whitehall for visiting foreign dignitaries, and the staging of this event reveals the extraordinary resources that Tudor monarchy devotes to the creation of impressive spectacle. The Great Hall has been transformed through hours of preparation that began before dawn. Hundreds of candles provide illumination that turns the space into a jewel box of flickering light and shadow. Tapestries have been hung to create the most impressive possible backdrop. The royal plate, gold and silver vessels accumulated over generations, covers tables arranged to maximize both practical function and visual impact. The meal itself represents a triumph of culinary engineering that requires the coordination of dozens of cooks, servers, and supervisors. The meal is served in 5 courses, each presenting multiple dishes arranged to create maximum visual and gustatory impact. Roasted meats alternate with elaborate pastries. Fish preparations showcase the resources of both river and sea. Exotic fruits and imported delicacies demonstrate England's growing commercial reach. Every dish reflects not merely culinary skill, but political messaging. The abundance and sophistication of English hospitality, the reach of English trade, the cultural refinement of English court life. Elizabeth's role during these banquets requires the same careful performance that characterizes every aspect of her daily routine. She must demonstrate appropriate appreciation for the food while maintaining royal dignity. She must engage in conversation that entertains guests while advancing diplomatic objectives. She must acknowledge the various entertainments provided while remaining the central focus of attention. As dinner is served, there are numerous entertainments, but Elizabeth's responses to these performances become part of the entertainment themselves. She prefers to sit and watch the performers, indicating her approval with an inclination of her head. These subtle gestures carry enormous weight. A royal nod can establish a performer's reputation, while royal indifference can end a career. You observe how musicians, dancers, and actors orient their performances toward the Queen's position, reading her expressions for signs of favor or displeasure. The entertainments ostensibly provide pleasure for all guests, but in reality, they exist primarily to create opportunities for Elizabeth to demonstrate the discriminating taste and cultural authority that legitimate her political power. As the evening progresses and the final courses are cleared away, the banquet transitions into dancing and more informal entertainment. But even these apparently relaxed activities follow careful protocols. Elizabeth's participation in dancing becomes a performance of grace and vitality that counters any suggestions that age might be diminishing her capabilities. Her choice of partners sends diplomatic messages about favor and alliance. Her decision to retire signals the end of the evening for everyone else, making her personal schedule into a timepiece that regulates the entire court's activities. Finally, after a long night of entertainments, the Queen retires, but it is some time before she will be able to fall into her bed. The process of transformation that began the day must now be reversed through an equally elaborate ritual of undressing and cleansing. Her ladies undress her and remove her makeup in what has become a nightly ceremony as formal as any state occasion. Her ladies undress her and remove her makeup with the kind of reverence given to a sacred ritual in a process that takes over an hour. sometimes two. The careful removal of each layer of clothing, the gentle cleansing of the toxic makeup, the brushing and care of the wig, all proceed with the same attention to detail that characterized the morning's preparation. But where the morning ritual created Gloriana, the evening ritual reveals the mortal woman beneath the elaborate construction of monarchy. The physical toll of this daily transformation becomes more apparent with each passing year. The lead-based makeup leaves her skin increasingly damaged and sensitive. The elaborate costumes create their own discomforts and restrictions. The constant performance of royal dignity requires an exhausting level of self-control and awareness. As her ladies work to restore her to something approaching natural appearance, you see glimpses of the fatigue that accumulates behind the carefully maintained facade of eternal majesty. Yet Elizabeth submits to this nightly ritual with the same discipline that she brings to every aspect of her royal role. She understands that successful monarchy requires not just the morning's transformation into an icon of authority, but also the evening's careful preservation of the illusion through proper maintenance of its physical foundations. The removal of makeup, the care of costumes, the attention to personal health, all serve the larger project of maintaining royal mystique through the accumulated effect of thousands of perfectly executed details. As the last traces of the day's performance are finally removed and Elizabeth prepares for the brief respite of sleep, you understand that her daily routine represents something far more complex than personal vanity or royal luxury. Each element of this elaborate choreography serves the essential work of creating and maintaining the illusion upon which Tudor monarchy depends, the illusion that one mortal woman possesses divine authority to rule over millions of subjects. The boring repetition of daily ritual, the exhausting attention to detail, the constant performance of royal dignity, all contribute to a form of political theatre that transforms personal rule into something that appears natural and inevitable. Tomorrow will bring the same elaborate cycle of transformation and performance, and the day after that, and the day after that, for as long as Elizabeth's body can sustain the demanding requirements of being not just a queen, but the very embodiment of monarchy itself. The winter morning of 1585 finds you observing the most intimate and dangerous aspects of Elizabeth's daily routine, the elaborate ritual of creating her public face through the application of cosmetics that are slowly killing her. In her private chambers, away from the eyes of courtiers and diplomats, the true cost of maintaining the image of eternal majesty becomes starkly apparent. As her skin deteriorated, it is said that she would layer on more and more, reaching a coverage that was 1 inch thick towards the end of her life. You witness the painstaking application of what court records euphemistically call Venetian ceruse, a mixture of white lead and vinegar that creates the stark, otherworldly pallor that has become Elizabeth's signature look. The servants who perform this daily ritual work with the focused concentration of alchemists, mixing fresh batches of the toxic paste with the precision required for any procedure that might affect royal health. The Queen submits to their ministrations with the stoic patience of someone who has long since accepted that the requirements of monarchy supersede personal comfort or safety. The process begins with the careful preparation of Elizabeth's face, which bears the accumulated damage of decades of lead exposure. Lead poisoning would have contributed to the poor health of her teeth and caused some of them to fall out, and the morning routine now includes attention to dental concerns that have become matters of state security. The Queen's smile, once natural and charming, must now be carefully managed to conceal gaps and discoloration that might undermine the image of royal perfection. Servants work with practiced efficiency to ensure that her remaining teeth are clean and that her lips can form the expressions required for public appearances. The application of the white lead paste requires extraordinary skill and patience. Working in thin layers to avoid visible demarcation lines, the Queen's women build up the coverage that will transform her aging skin into the marble-like surface expected of the Virgin Queen. Each layer must dry completely before the next can be applied, extending the morning ritual to unprecedented lengths. The toxic fumes from the lead-based mixture fill the chamber, requiring windows to be opened despite the winter cold to prevent everyone present from suffering immediate ill effects. Between lead and mercury, there were now two toxins that were causing harm to Elizabeth and her health due to her deadly makeup regime. The mercury component comes into play during the evening removal process, when solvents containing the toxic metal are required to dissolve the increasingly thick layers of lead-based cosmetics. This creates a vicious cycle of poisoning. Lead applied each morning, mercury used each evening, both substances accumulating in the Queen's system and causing progressive damage to her nervous system, cognitive function, and physical health. You observe how the Queen's ladies have developed elaborate workarounds for the practical problems created by this toxic beauty regimen. Special brushes with ivory handles prevent the servants' hands from coming into direct contact with the lead paste. Protective coverings shield the Queen's clothing during application. Elaborate ventilation procedures minimize exposure to toxic fumes. The entire process has evolved into a form of industrial safety protocol disguised as a beauty ritual, with each participant understanding that they are handling materials dangerous enough to cause permanent injury or death. The completion of the white face paint provides the foundation for the more elaborate artistry that follows. Her lips and cheeks are painted with rouge made from egg whites and red dye, creating the stark contrast between deadly pallor and vivid color that has become synonymous with Elizabethan court fashion. But the rouge itself presents additional challenges. The egg whites provide a protein base that can spoil in warm weather, creating the risk of facial infections, while the red dyes often contain their own toxic compounds that add to the Queen's daily chemical burden. The psychological effects of this daily poisoning have become increasingly apparent to those closest to Elizabeth. Side effects of being gradually poisoned by mercury include memory loss, irritability, and depression, symptoms which the Queen in fact experienced towards the end of her life. You witness moments when the Queen pauses in mid-sentence, struggling to recall words that once came effortlessly. Her famous temper, always formidable, has become more unpredictable, swinging between charm and rage with little apparent provocation. The depression that increasingly shadows her private moments provides a stark contrast to the image of confident authority she maintains in public. The application of the wig represents another daily challenge that has grown more complex with time. Elizabeth's natural hair, damaged by decades of lead exposure and harsh chemical treatments, has become too thin and fragile to support elaborate styling. The wigs that replace her natural hair must be positioned with extreme precision to create the illusion of abundant red locks while concealing the reality of chemical baldness. The construction of these hairpieces requires the skills of specialized craftsmen who understand both the aesthetic requirements of royal fashion and the practical limitations imposed by the Queen's damaged scalp. The morning ritual concludes with the application of perfumes and oils designed to mask the chemical odors that emanate from the toxic cosmetics. These fragrances, themselves often containing alcohol and other volatile compounds, add another layer of complexity to the Queen's daily chemical exposure. The servants who apply these finishing touches work quickly and efficiently, understanding that prolonged exposure to the concentrated aromas can cause headaches and nausea, even in those not directly poisoned by lead and mercury. Once fully transformed, Elizabeth emerges from her private chambers as Gloriana, the iconic Virgin Queen, whose image has become synonymous with English nationalism and imperial ambition. But you understand that this daily transformation exacts a price that goes far beyond the hours consumed in its execution. Each morning's creation of the royal icon requires the systematic poisoning of the mortal woman who inhabits that carefully constructed image. The lead and mercury that create the illusion of eternal youth and perfect beauty are simultaneously destroying the nervous system, cognitive function, and physical health of the person they are meant to glorify. The tragic irony of Elizabeth's situation becomes clearer as you observe the complete dependence of her political authority on the maintenance of this toxic disguise. The Virgin Queen's power rests partly on the image of perfection created by her elaborate daily makeup ritual, but that same ritual is gradually destroying her ability to think clearly, remember accurately, and maintain the emotional stability required for effective governance. The very practices that create her public authority are undermining the private capabilities that make such authority meaningful. As the morning transforms into afternoon, Elizabeth begins the long day of public performance that her elaborate preparation has made possible. But beneath the inch-thick layer of white lead, behind the carefully painted features that create the illusion of ageless beauty, a 52-year-old woman is slowly dying from the accumulated effects of decades of systematic self-poisoning. The boring repetition of daily makeup application, the careful attention to cosmetic detail, the endless pursuit of perfect royal appearance, all contribute to a form of beauty regimen that represents one of history's most sustained and methodical forms of accidental suicide. The courtiers who observe Elizabeth's daily transformation see only the miraculous emergence of royal majesty from private chambers. They witness the creation of an icon, the daily renewal of dynastic authority, the careful preservation of the image upon which English stability depends. They do not see the toxic chemistry that makes this transformation possible, the gradual accumulation of heavy metals in the royal nervous system, or the slow erosion of cognitive and emotional stability that accompanies each day's creation of perfect royal beauty. You understand that Elizabeth's daily makeup ritual represents something far more significant than personal vanity or even political theatre. It embodies the fundamental contradiction of absolute monarchy, the requirement that mortal humans sustain the illusion of divine authority even when that illusion demands their systematic self-destruction. The lead and mercury that create Gloriana are simultaneously destroying Elizabeth, creating a perfect metaphor for the way that the requirements of royal performance consume the people who attempt to fulfill them. The afternoon sun filters through the palace windows as Elizabeth, fully transformed once again into the Virgin Queen, prepares to begin another day of the elaborate performance that has defined her reign for nearly 3 decades. But each day's performance requires a higher price, each morning's transformation demands more toxic materials, and each evening's restoration becomes more difficult as the accumulated damage of decades makes the illusion of royal perfection increasingly hard to maintain. As winter deepens and Elizabeth approaches what history will remember as the final decades of her reign, the daily ritual of creating Gloriana from the raw materials of mortality becomes both more essential and more destructive. The boring repetition of cosmetic application, the careful maintenance of royal appearance, the endless pursuit of perfect majesty, all continue with mechanical precision even as they gradually destroy the very person they are meant to glorify. You find yourself in the autumn of 1558, standing in the corridors of Hatfield House, as news arrives that will transform Elizabeth Tudor from bastard princess to Queen of England. But even as 25-year-old Elizabeth accepts the crown that makes her one of Europe's most powerful rulers, you witness the immediate emergence of the question that will define her reign. Whom will she marry? The marriage of a queen represents far more than personal choice. It becomes a tool of international diplomacy, domestic politics and dynastic strategy that requires constant management and manipulation. In the early weeks of Elizabeth's reign, her court buzzed with suitors. The transformation from excluded bastard to eligible queen happens with bewildering speed, and you observe how quickly European courts begin calculating the advantages of alliance with England's new monarch. The new queen received offers of marriage from King Philip of Spain, Prince Eric of Sweden, and numerous other continental rulers who see in Elizabeth's accession an opportunity to reshape the balance of European power through matrimonial alliance. But the most intriguing and ultimately most significant courtship comes from within England itself, in the person of Lord Robert Dudley. You watch as the complex relationship between Elizabeth and Dudley unfolds against the backdrop of court politics and personal affection that will define the early years of her reign. Robert Dudley was one of Elizabeth's favourites, a long-term suitor and believed by many to have been her one true love. Their relationship provides a perfect case study in how personal desire intersects with political necessity in the life of a 16th-century monarch. The daily interactions between Elizabeth and Dudley reveal the extraordinary complexity of conducting a romance under the scrutiny of an entire court. As Master of the Horse, Dudley enjoys legitimate reasons for frequent access to the Queen, but every conversation between them becomes subject to interpretation by observers who understand that royal favour can shift the balance of power throughout the kingdom. You observe how they develop subtle forms of communication, meaningful glances during formal ceremonies, carefully chosen words that carry double meanings, strategic positioning during court events that suggests intimacy without confirming it. Elizabeth's fondness for Dudley and his proximity to her as Master of the Horse and Privy Councillor made him influential and envied for his access to the Queen. This influence creates a complex dynamic that affects every aspect of court life. Other courtiers must navigate their relationships with Dudley carefully, understanding that he represents a potential pathway to royal favour, while also embodying the risks of backing a favourite who might fall from grace. Foreign ambassadors study his relationship with Elizabeth as carefully as they analyse formal diplomatic communications, recognizing that personal influence often carries more weight than official policy. She called Dudley her eyes and sweet Robin, endearments that suggest genuine affection while carefully avoiding more formal titles that might imply official engagement. The development of this private language between Queen and favourite reveals Elizabeth's early mastery of the delicate balance required to maintain personal relationships while preserving political flexibility. Every term of endearment becomes a small diplomatic document, conveying enough warmth to sustain the relationship while avoiding commitments that might constrain future options. The question of Dudley's marital status adds another layer of complexity to an already intricate situation. He is married to Amy Robsart, a union that presents an absolute barrier to any official relationship with Elizabeth, while creating opportunities for scandal that could damage both the Queen's reputation and England's international standing. You observe how this situation requires constant management, public appearances that acknowledge Dudley's legitimate wife, private moments that preserve his relationship with Elizabeth, and careful navigation of the social expectations that surround both legitimate marriage and royal favour. The match was opposed by many who thought that it was inappropriate for Elizabeth to marry a subject and feared the power and influence that Dudley would obtain as her husband. This opposition comes from multiple directions and for various reasons, creating a complex political environment that Elizabeth must navigate with extraordinary care. English nobles fear that Dudley's elevation would upset established hierarchies and create new sources of competition for royal favour. Foreign courts worry that Elizabeth's marriage to an Englishman would reduce their own opportunities for influential alliance. Religious authorities express concern about the implications for England's international relationships and domestic stability. The practical management of these competing pressures requires Elizabeth to develop sophisticated techniques for managing expectations while preserving options. You watch as she masters the art of encouraging courtship without making commitments, of allowing relationships to develop while avoiding conclusions, of using the possibility of marriage as a diplomatic tool while never quite promising to employ it. These skills will prove essential throughout her reign, but their development during the Dudley courtship establishes patterns that will characterize all her subsequent romantic and diplomatic relationships. The international implications of Elizabeth's marital choices become apparent as foreign courts begin to adjust their strategies based on perceived developments in her relationship with Dudley. While marriage offered strategic advantages at the cost of a permanent entanglement, protracted courtships promised short-term strategic and diplomatic gains. Spanish ambassadors report extensively on signs of intimacy between Elizabeth and Dudley, understanding that an English marriage would end their hopes of controlling English policy through a Habsburg alliance. French courts similarly monitor the relationship, calculating how Dudley's influence might affect England's position in continental conflicts. The domestic political implications prove equally complex. Parliament begins to express concern about the succession, understanding that Elizabeth's choice of husband will determine not only England's international alliances but also the dynasty that will inherit the throne. You observe how members of Parliament attempt to influence the Queen's decision through careful presentations of various options, each framed in terms of England's long-term interests, while reflecting the presenter's own political calculations. The day-to-day management of this complex situation requires Elizabeth to maintain multiple simultaneous performances. With Dudley, she must balance genuine affection against political necessity. With other suitors, she must demonstrate sufficient interest to preserve diplomatic options, while avoiding commitments that might foreclose alternatives. With her subjects, she must project confidence in her ability to secure England's future through appropriate marriage, while not appearing desperate or indecisive. With foreign courts, she must suggest accessibility while maintaining the independence that makes England a valuable ally rather than a subordinate partner. The psychological toll of maintaining these multiple performances becomes apparent in the increasing complexity of court protocols surrounding royal courtship. Every public appearance requires careful choreography to avoid sending unintended signals. Every private meeting must be structured to prevent misunderstanding while allowing genuine communication. Every diplomatic correspondence must balance honesty with strategic ambiguity. The sheer effort required to manage these relationships effectively represents a form of labor that consumes enormous amounts of royal time and energy. As 1559 progresses, you witness Elizabeth's growing sophistication in using the marriage question as a tool of statecraft. She begins to understand that the possibility of marriage often provides more leverage than marriage itself, that the process of courtship can advance English interests more effectively than any particular alliance. This realization marks the beginning of what will become her distinctive approach to international relations, the use of her own marriage ability as a diplomatic resource that can be deployed strategically without ever being completely expended. But questions remain that will shape the entire trajectory of her reign. Can she maintain the delicate balance between personal desire and political necessity indefinitely? Will the pressure for marriage eventually force her to choose between love and duty? How long can she use the promise of marriage as a diplomatic tool before that promise loses credibility? The answers to these questions lie hidden in the future, but their importance shapes every decision Elizabeth makes as she begins to master the complex art of ruling as an unmarried queen in a world that expects royal women to secure their kingdoms. Through matrimonial alliance, the stage is set for a courtship that will define not only Elizabeth's personal happiness, but also England's place in the emerging European balance of power. The marriage game has begun, and Elizabeth must prove herself as skilled a player as any diplomat in Europe if she hopes to preserve both her independence and her kingdom. The year 1560 brings a shocking development that will forever alter the dynamics of Elizabeth's relationship with Robert Dudley and establish patterns of matrimonial diplomacy that will define her entire reign. You witness the aftermath of Amy Robsart's mysterious death at Cumnor Place, an event that simultaneously removes the primary obstacle to Elizabeth's marriage to Dudley while creating an insurmountable barrier of scandal and suspicion. He was also already married until his wife died in suspicious circumstances in 1560. Although Dudley was cleared of any involvement, rumours persisted, and his reputation was tainted. The management of this crisis reveals Elizabeth's growing mastery of political damage control and her emerging understanding of how personal scandal can be transformed into diplomatic opportunity. You observe how she navigates the immediate aftermath of Amy's death with extraordinary care, maintaining sufficient distance from Dudley to avoid implication in the tragedy while preserving their relationship enough to prevent his complete political destruction. The delicate balance she strikes becomes a model for her handling of subsequent romantic and political challenges. It was at this point that Elizabeth realized she could not marry him. This recognition marks a crucial turning point in her approach to marriage and statecraft. Rather than treating the loss of her preferred marital option as a political disaster, Elizabeth begins to understand how the continuation of courtship without conclusion can serve larger strategic purposes. The techniques she develops for managing her relationship with Dudley after Amy's death will later be applied to international suitors with devastating diplomatic effectiveness. Instead, she made Dudley the Earl of Leicester in 1564, and the two remained close until his death in 1588. The elevation of Dudley to Leicester represents a masterpiece of political theatre that accomplishes multiple objectives simultaneously. For Dudley, it provides compensation for the marriage that can never happen while confirming his continued access to royal favour. For Elizabeth, it demonstrates her ability to reward loyalty while maintaining ultimate control over her marital destiny. For foreign observers, it signals that the Queen can manage personal relationships without allowing them to constrain political decision-making. The daily management of the Leicester relationship after 1564 reveals the extraordinary sophistication Elizabeth brings to the task of maintaining intimate friendship while preserving political independence. You watch as she develops protocols that allow Leicester continued access to her private chambers, while ensuring that such access cannot be interpreted as evidence of secret marriage. She creates a new category of court relationship, the elevated favourite, who enjoys many privileges of a royal consort without the legal status or political authority that marriage would confer. But even as Elizabeth settles into this complex domestic arrangement, international pressure for her marriage intensifies. She knew how to leverage these proposals as political tools, and the decade of the 1560s witnesses her growing sophistication in using the marriage question to advance English interests across Europe. Each potential suitor represents not just a personal choice but an entire diplomatic strategy, with marriages to different candidates offering distinct advantages and risks for England's international position. The courtship with Archduke Charles of Austria provides a perfect example of how Elizabeth has learned to extract maximum diplomatic advantage from marriage negotiations without ever intending to conclude them successfully. The Archduke represents the possibility of alliance with the Habsburg Empire, a connection that could provide England with crucial support against French expansion while avoiding the dangers of Spanish domination. You observe how Elizabeth manages this courtship through years of careful correspondence, strategic encouragement, and calculated delays that keep the possibility alive while avoiding firm commitment. The practical mechanics of conducting international courtship in the 16th century require extraordinary attention to detail and enormous patience from all participants. Every letter between Elizabeth and potential suitors must be crafted to convey appropriate interest while preserving maximum flexibility. Every diplomatic mission sent to negotiate marriage terms requires careful briefing to ensure that English representatives can engage seriously with foreign courts without exceeding their authority to make binding commitments. Every response to foreign marriage proposals must balance courtesy with calculated ambiguity. The development of these courtship protocols transforms Elizabeth's court into a center of international matrimonial diplomacy that attracts attention from across Europe. You witness the arrival of special ambassadors sent specifically to negotiate marriage terms, each accompanied by elaborate retinues designed to demonstrate their principal's wealth and power. These missions require careful management to ensure that each receives appropriate attention while none gains advantages that might offend others. The Queen's schedule becomes a complex diplomatic instrument with access to royal audiences serving as both reward for serious negotiation and incentive for continued engagement. Prince Eric negotiated for Elizabeth's hand in marriage for several years, but in 1560 she eventually wrote him a letter politely declining his suit. This correspondence illustrates Elizabeth's growing mastery of the gentle art of romantic rejection that preserves diplomatic relationships while closing off unwanted marital possibilities. The letters she composes during this period establish formulas for maintaining cordial relations with disappointed suitors while making clear that the door to marriage has been permanently closed. The psychological demands of managing multiple, simultaneous courtships while maintaining the Leicester relationship require Elizabeth to develop extraordinary emotional discipline. You observe how she compartmentalizes her interactions with different suitors, bringing genuine warmth to each relationship, while never allowing any single courtship to eclipse her larger strategic calculations. The skill she demonstrates in maintaining apparently sincere romantic interest with multiple partners simultaneously reflects not deception, but rather a sophisticated understanding of how personal relationships can serve larger political purposes. The question of religious compatibility adds another layer of complexity to Elizabeth's marriage negotiations. Protestant suitors offer the advantage of religious harmony, but often come from smaller, weaker states that provide limited military or financial support. Catholic suitors represent more powerful potential allies, but raise serious concerns about England's religious settlement and international independence. Elizabeth learns to navigate these competing considerations by emphasizing areas of compatibility while downplaying potential sources of conflict. The domestic political implications of her various international courtships require equally careful management. Parliament continues to press for marriage and succession, but different factions favor different potential husbands based on their own political calculations. Elizabeth must balance these competing domestic pressures while avoiding commitments that might alienate important constituencies. You watch as she develops techniques for acknowledging parliamentary concerns about marriage while deflecting pressure for specific choices that might constrain her diplomatic flexibility. As the 1560s progress, Elizabeth's reputation as a skilled diplomatic player begins to attract suitors who see marriage to the English Queen as much for the political alliance as for personal affection. This shift changes the dynamics of her courtships, transforming them from primarily romantic encounters into explicitly political negotiations. The change requires Elizabeth to develop new strategies for managing relationships that are openly transactional while preserving the fiction of romantic interest that makes such negotiations socially acceptable. The arrival of ambassadors from increasingly distant courts reflects Elizabeth's growing international reputation and the expanding scope of her matrimonial diplomacy. Marriage proposals arrive from Scandinavian princes, German dukes, Italian nobles, and even distant Russian rulers who see alliance with England as worth the enormous effort required to conduct courtship across such vast distances. Each new suitor represents both opportunity and obligation, requiring Elizabeth to maintain awareness of political developments across an ever-widening geographic area. But as Elizabeth approaches her 30th birthday in 1563, questions about her biological clock begin to intersect with political calculations about marriage in new and pressing ways. The window for childbearing will not remain open indefinitely, and the pressure to secure the succession through marriage intensifies as the years pass without resolution. Yet Elizabeth has begun to discover advantages in maintaining her unmarried status that may outweigh even the crucial question of dynastic continuity. The stage is set for the most significant courtship of Elizabeth's career, her relationship with Francis, Duke of Anjou, which will test all the diplomatic and emotional skills she has developed during the first decade of her reign. The year 1572 brings the most serious marriage negotiation of Elizabeth's reign, as the complex diplomatic landscape of Europe creates conditions that make her union with Francis, Duke of Anjou, appear not just advantageous but potentially essential for England's survival. You observe how the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre has reshuffled continental alliances, making Protestant England increasingly isolated and vulnerable to Catholic aggression. In this dangerous environment, marriage to the brother of the French king offers the possibility of crucial military and diplomatic support, but at enormous costs that will test Elizabeth's political judgment to its limits. The second suitor, whom Elizabeth seriously considered, was Francis, Duke of Anjou, brother of King Henry III of France. Although this suitor came with political benefits, Elizabeth was genuinely attracted to the much younger duke and eager to marry him. This unusual combination of political necessity and personal attraction creates the most complex courtship of Elizabeth's career, requiring her to balance genuine emotion against strategic calculation while managing domestic opposition that threatens to tear her government apart. The age difference between Elizabeth and Anjou, she is 39 when serious negotiations begin, while he is only 23, provides endless material for contemporary commentary and historical speculation. You witness how Elizabeth responds to criticism of this disparity with a mixture of defiance and vulnerability that reveals the personal stakes involved in this negotiation. Her genuine attraction to Anjou's youth and charm conflicts with her awareness that such a marriage would inevitably be seen as the desperate choice of an aging queen seeking to maintain the illusion of youthful desirability. The practical management of this international courtship requires unprecedented coordination between English and French courts. Secret negotiations proceed through multiple diplomatic channels, with special ambassadors carrying encoded messages that require careful protection from Spanish and papal spies eager to disrupt any Anglo-French alliance. You observe the elaborate security protocols that surround these communications, with letters written in multiple ciphers and backup copies sent through entirely separate routes to ensure that crucial negotiations cannot be sabotaged by intercepted correspondence. Anjou was the last serious contender for Elizabeth's hand in marriage. When this letter was written, Elizabeth was 45 and her suitor just 23. The National Archives preserve correspondence that reveals the extraordinary complexity of conducting such negotiations across cultural and linguistic barriers. Every letter requires translation not just of language, but of diplomatic convention, with subtle differences in courtly etiquette capable of creating serious misunderstandings that might derail years of careful negotiation. The development of personal intimacy between Elizabeth and Anjou during his visits to England creates unprecedented challenges for court protocol and domestic politics. Foreign princes who come courting typically maintain formal distance from their potential brides, but Anjou's extended stays at English court allow for the kind of sustained personal interaction that makes genuine romance possible. You witness how Elizabeth's ladies struggle to manage situations that have no precedent in royal protocol, how to chaperone a queen who is simultaneously sovereign and suitor, how to maintain appropriate dignity while allowing for the private. Conversations essential to serious courtship. The domestic opposition to the Anjou match reveals the fundamental tensions that surround any royal marriage, but the religious dimensions of this particular courtship create especially explosive political conditions. Her council, however, was deeply divided about the proposed Anglo-French alliance, not to mention marriage to a Catholic. You observe how this division fractures Elizabeth's government along lines that will shape English politics for decades, with Protestant hardliners led by Francis Walsingham opposing any accommodation with Catholic powers, while more pragmatic advisers recognize the military necessity of French alliance against Spanish aggression. The management of this internal opposition requires Elizabeth to deploy all the political skills she has developed over 2 decades of rule. Cabinet meetings become elaborate exercises in diplomatic management, with the Queen working to maintain government unity while pursuing a policy that many of her most trusted advisers consider disastrous. You watch as she develops techniques for isolating opposition, rewarding loyalty, and maintaining forward momentum on negotiations despite fundamental disagreements among her inner circle. She was said to be fond of his attention, allowing the marriage negotiations to continue despite vigorous objections from her advisers. This fondness creates the most dangerous political situation of Elizabeth's reign, as her personal feelings begin to override the calculated political judgment that has previously characterized her approach to marriage. The Queen, who has spent decades using courtship as a diplomatic tool, finds herself genuinely emotionally invested in a relationship that threatens to constrain her political flexibility. The practical arrangements for Anjou's extended stays in England require elaborate coordination between the French and English courts. Guest quarters must be prepared that acknowledge his royal status while avoiding the implications of permanent residence. Entertainment must be provided that demonstrates English hospitality while maintaining appropriate formality. Security arrangements must protect a foreign prince who represents both crucial alliance and potential vulnerability to assassination attempts by religious extremists opposed to Catholic influence in England. The financial implications of prolonged marriage negotiations create their own political complications. The expenses associated with entertaining Anjou and his retinue strain the royal treasury, while the dowry negotiations reveal fundamental disagreements about Elizabeth's value as a marriage partner. French negotiators seek terms that acknowledge Anjou's sacrifice in marrying an aging queen unlikely to produce many heirs, while English representatives insist on arrangements that preserve national dignity and financial independence. The question of religious practice becomes the most contentious element of the marriage negotiations. Anjou's Catholicism requires accommodation that threatens the religious settlement Elizabeth has spent decades establishing, but complete conversion appears politically impossible for a French prince whose position depends partly on Catholic support. You observe how negotiators develop increasingly complex formulas designed to allow Anjou private Catholic worship while maintaining public adherence to Anglican practice, compromises that satisfy no one while offending everyone. The international implications of the Anjou courtship extend far beyond Anglo-French relations, as every European court adjusts its calculations based on the perceived likelihood of this marriage. Spanish ambassadors work desperately to sabotage negotiations that would create a powerful anti-Habsburg alliance, while Protestant German princes express concern about England's potential abandonment of the Reformed cause. The marriage question becomes a lens through which all European powers view England's future reliability as an ally or threat as an enemy. As negotiations reach their climax in 1581, you witness Elizabeth facing the most difficult decision of her political career. The marriage offers genuine political advantages at a moment when England desperately needs continental allies, but The domestic costs threaten to destroy the religious and political consensus that has enabled her successful rule. In 1581, Elizabeth bowed to the pressure and called off the negotiations. The decision to abandon the Anjou marriage marks a crucial turning point in Elizabeth's approach to both matrimony and statecraft. You observe how she manages the delicate process of ending negotiations that have consumed years of diplomatic effort while preserving enough goodwill to maintain the French alliance that England still desperately needs. The letters she writes to Anjou during this period reveal her sophisticated understanding of how to transform romantic rejection into political cooperation. The domestic political aftermath of the abandoned Anjou negotiations requires careful management to prevent the government fractures that opened during the courtship from becoming permanent divisions. Elizabeth must reconcile advisers who opposed the marriage without appearing to acknowledge that their opposition was justified, while rewarding those who supported her personal inclinations without confirming that policy should be driven by royal emotion rather than national interest. Unable to marry the man of her choice without tarnishing her reputation or causing national divisions, Elizabeth remained single for the rest of her reign. This decision to embrace permanent spinsterhood represents a revolutionary approach to female monarchy that will influence royal women for centuries. Elizabeth transforms what might appear to be personal failure into political strategy, using her unmarried status as a diplomatic resource while developing new models for legitimate female authority that do not depend on matrimonial alliance. The psychological impact of abandoning her last realistic chance for marriage and motherhood creates private struggles that Elizabeth must carefully conceal from public view. You observe how she develops new forms of symbolic maternity, referring to England as her husband and her subjects as her children in ways that transform personal sacrifice into political virtue. The elaborate rhetoric of virginal dedication to the Commonwealth masks genuine grief while creating new vocabularies for describing female power. The aftermath of the Anjou negotiations also marks the beginning of Elizabeth's transformation from potential bride to virgin icon, a shift that requires fundamental changes in court protocol and international diplomacy. The techniques she has spent decades developing for managing courtship must be adapted to discourage rather than encourage romantic interest, while maintaining the diplomatic flexibility that has served England so well during her matrimonial period. She also steadfastly refused to allow discussion about the succession. This refusal to address the dynastic implications of her decision reflects Elizabeth's determination to control the political narrative surrounding her unmarried status. Rather than allowing Parliament or foreign courts to frame spinsterhood as policy failure, she insists on treating it as deliberate choice that serves England's interests more effectively than any marriage could. As early as 1559, she made her reasons clear in a message to the House of Commons. Assuredly, if my successor were known to the world, I would never esteem my state to be safe. This explanation reveals the sophisticated political calculation behind Elizabeth's approach to both marriage and succession. By maintaining uncertainty about England's future, she preserves diplomatic flexibility while preventing the development of alternative power centers that might challenge her authority. The long-term consequences of Elizabeth's decision to remain unmarried will reshape English monarchy and international relations for generations. Her successful rule as the Virgin Queen establishes precedents for independent female authority while demonstrating that matrimonial alliance, though traditionally essential for royal women, can be sacrificed to larger political considerations. The marriage game that has defined the first half of her reign gives way to new forms of diplomatic strategy that will characterize its triumphant conclusion. As Elizabeth enters the final decades of her reign, the question that has dominated her political life for more than 20 years finally receives its definitive answer. The Queen, who spent decades using the possibility of marriage as a diplomatic weapon, has chosen to remain forever a bride to England alone, transforming personal sacrifice into the foundation for a new model of successful female monarchy that will inspire royal women for centuries to come. You find yourself in the autumn of 1601 witnessing the final great performance of Elizabeth Bentley's political theatre as she prepares to address Parliament for what will prove to be the last time. The Queen, now 68 years old, faces a chamber filled with increasingly restless members who have grown bold enough to challenge royal prerogatives that previous generations would never have questioned. The monopolies crisis that has brought Parliament together represents more than economic policy. It embodies the fundamental question of whether Tudor monarchy can adapt to changing times while maintaining its essential authority. The physical preparation for what will become known as the Golden Speech reveals the enormous effort now required to maintain the illusion of royal vigor. The lead-based makeup has caused hair loss, skin deterioration, and gradual poisoning that affects her memory and mood, forcing her ladies to spend even more time creating the appearance of health and vitality. You observe how they have developed new techniques for concealing the tremor in her hands, the slight stoop in her shoulders, and the increasing frailty that threatens to undermine the image of eternal majesty upon which her authority depends. The economic circumstances that have forced this parliamentary session reflect larger changes in English society that challenge traditional royal prerogatives. The monopoly system, once an accepted mechanism for royal patronage and economic regulation, has become increasingly unpopular as prices rise and commercial restrictions multiply. You witness how Elizabeth's courtiers struggle to balance their desire for profitable monopolies against their awareness that public resentment threatens to destabilize the entire system of royal favor upon which their positions depend. Parliament had complained about the abuse of royal monopolies, which had led to price inflation and popular hardship. The protests extend beyond simple economic grievance to challenge fundamental assumptions about royal authority over commercial activity. Members of Parliament no longer simply petition for redress of specific grievances, but question the legitimacy of an entire system of economic privilege that has enriched courtiers while burdening ordinary subjects. The careful choreography required to manage this constitutional crisis reveals Elizabeth's continuing mastery of political theatre, even as her physical capabilities decline. Every element of the parliamentary session must be orchestrated to acknowledge legitimate grievances while preserving essential royal prerogatives. The timing of speeches, the order of speakers, even the physical arrangement of the chamber all serve larger strategic purposes that extend far beyond the immediate question of monopolies. MPs convened to thank the Queen for promising reforms and expected further measures on pricing and monopolies. But Elizabeth understands that simply addressing economic complaints will not resolve the deeper constitutional tensions that have emerged during the final years of her reign. The monopolies crisis represents a symptom of larger changes in the relationship between Crown and Parliament that require more fundamental responses than technical policy adjustments. The development of Elizabeth's response to this crisis demonstrates her sophisticated understanding of how personal appeal can transcend institutional conflict. Rather than defending monopolies as matters of royal prerogative or dismissing parliamentary complaints as presumptuous interference, she chooses to transform the crisis into an opportunity for emotional reconciliation that reinforces rather than diminishes royal authority. On 30 November 1601, Elizabeth addressed 141 members of the House of Commons, including the Speaker, in what would be her last Parliament. The decision to address Parliament personally rather than through intermediaries represents a calculated risk that could either restore royal prestige or expose the Queen's increasing frailty to critical observation. You witness how her advisers debate the wisdom of such direct exposure, weighing the potential benefits of personal appeal against the dangers of revealing weakness. The physical demands of preparing for this address require extraordinary effort from both Elizabeth and her household. The journey from her private chambers to the parliamentary chamber must be managed to minimize the appearance of difficulty while maintaining appropriate ceremony. The speech itself must be delivered with enough strength and clarity to convince observers of continued royal vigor, despite the voice problems and memory issues that have become increasingly apparent in private conversations. The emotional preparation for this address reveals Elizabeth's awareness that she is crafting not just a response to immediate political crisis, but a statement that will define her historical legacy. You observe how she works through multiple drafts of her remarks, refining not just the content but the emotional register that will allow her to transform policy disagreement into personal testimony about her relationship with her subjects. The actual delivery of what becomes known as the Golden Speech represents a masterpiece of political performance that demonstrates Elizabeth's undiminished understanding of how monarchy must adapt to survive. Instead of announcing new economic measures, Elizabeth offered a moving declaration of her love and duty to her subjects. This unexpected approach transforms what might have been a defensive response to criticism into an offensive assertion of moral authority that places opponents in the position of appearing ungrateful rather than justified. She thanked MPs for exposing monopolists, insisted her grants were lawful and guided by conscience, and affirmed she valued the hearts of her people above royal grandeur. These carefully chosen words acknowledge legitimate grievances while maintaining royal dignity, accepting responsibility for problems while preserving essential authority. The speech demonstrates Elizabeth's mastery of the delicate balance between accountability and majesty that defines successful constitutional monarchy. The immediate impact of the Golden Speech exceeds even Elizabeth's expectations. As hardened, politicians find themselves moved to tears by her apparent sincerity and emotional vulnerability. You witness how the Queen's willingness to appear personally before Parliament and acknowledge the validity of their concerns transforms potential opponents into renewed supporters, restoring the emotional connection between Crown and Commons that has been strained by years of economic hardship and political tension. But the effort required to deliver this triumph takes an enormous toll on Elizabeth's declining health and energy. The hours of preparation, the physical strain of public appearance, and the emotional intensity of personal appeal combine to exhaust reserves that are no longer easily replenished. You observe how her ladies work frantically after the speech to restore her appearance and energy for the informal conversations that must follow any major parliamentary address. The longer-term implications of the Golden Speech extend far beyond the immediate resolution of the monopolies crisis. Elizabeth has demonstrated that Tudor monarchy can adapt to changing political circumstances through personal appeal and emotional connection, rather than institutional reform or constitutional change. This approach preserves royal authority while acknowledging popular concerns, creating a model that will influence English constitutional development for generations. The success of this approach also reveals the extent to which Elizabeth's authority has become personal rather than institutional, depending more on her individual charisma and political skill than on abstract principles of royal prerogative. This personalization of monarchy creates both opportunities and vulnerabilities, allowing for extraordinary flexibility in responding to political challenges while making the entire system dependent on the continuing capabilities of a single, aging individual. As Elizabeth returns to her private chambers after the parliamentary session, you understand that she has achieved another remarkable political victory, transforming potential disaster into renewed legitimacy through the same combination of calculated performance and genuine emotion that has characterized her entire reign. But the cost of such victories grows higher with each passing year, and questions about succession become more pressing as the physical and mental demands of maintaining Tudor monarchy begin to exceed even Elizabeth's extraordinary capabilities. Will the golden speech marks both the culmination of Elizabeth's political artistry and the beginning of the final phase of her reign, as she enters the last years of a life that has been consumed by the relentless demands of maintaining the illusion that mortal woman can successfully embody divine monarchy. The winter of 1602 settles over England with unusual severity, and you observe how the cold seems to penetrate the very bones of the aging queen who has ruled for more than 40 years. At 69, Elizabeth faces daily challenges that would have been unimaginable during the triumphant middle years of her reign. Memory loss, irritability, and depression, symptoms which the Queen in fact experienced towards the end of her life, reflect the accumulated damage of decades of lead and mercury poisoning that has slowly been destroying her nervous system while creating the iconic appearance that defined Gloriana. The mourning ritual of transformation has become increasingly difficult and time-consuming as Elizabeth's physical condition deteriorates. As she ages, the amount of heavy makeup she cakes on increases, eventually leaving her face as white as a sheet. You witness how her ladies now require nearly 3 hours to complete the daily creation of the royal icon, working with increasing desperation to conceal evidence of mortality beneath ever thicker layers of toxic cosmetics. The psychological toll of maintaining the elaborate fiction of eternal youth while confronting the reality of aging creates new forms of private suffering that Elizabeth must carefully conceal from public observation. The mirrors in her private chambers have been repositioned or removed entirely, eliminating casual reminders of physical decline that might interfere with her ability to perform the role of immortal sovereign. Her ladies learn to manage their expressions when attending to her personal needs, suppressing any reaction that might acknowledge the growing gap between public image and private reality. The question of succession, which Elizabeth has successfully avoided throughout her reign, becomes impossible to ignore as her health visibly declines. She also steadfastly refused to allow discussion about the succession, but courtiers and foreign ambassadors now monitor every cough, every stumble, every sign of weakness for clues about the timing of the inevitable transition. The entire machinery of government begins to operate with divided attention, continuing to serve the present monarch while secretly preparing for her replacement. Robert Cecil and other members of the Privy Council develop elaborate protocols for managing the delicate period when Elizabeth's incapacity becomes apparent, but her death has not yet occurred. These contingency plans must account for the possibility of gradual decline, sudden collapse, or the kind of mental deterioration that might leave the Queen alive but unable to govern effectively. You observe how these discussions proceed in carefully coded language that never explicitly acknowledges the possibility of royal mortality while thoroughly preparing for its consequences. The court atmosphere during this period reflects the psychological strain of serving a monarch whose authority depends on the illusion of immortality while her mortality becomes increasingly obvious. Courtiers must continue to perform the elaborate ceremonies of royal service while privately preparing for the political reshuffling that will follow Elizabeth's death. The contradictions create a surreal environment where everyone participates in maintaining a fiction that everyone knows to be false. James VI of Scotland emerges as the most likely successor, and secret communications begin between his representatives and English court officials eager to secure their positions under the new regime. These negotiations require extraordinary discretion, as any premature acknowledgement of Elizabeth's inevitable death could be construed as treason. You witness how letters are written in codes within codes with multiple layers of meaning that allow for plausible deniability while establishing the connections essential for political survival. The physical spaces of the court begin to reflect the temporal tension between present service and future transition. Private chambers that once buzzed with current business now host whispered conversations about post-Elizabeth arrangements. Libraries and archives become sites of historical research as courtiers attempt to establish precedents for the kind of smooth transition that England has not experienced for more than 4 decades. Elizabeth's own awareness of these preparations creates additional psychological pressure as she struggles to maintain authority while knowing that her subjects are already mentally preparing for her replacement. The loneliness of this position, ruling while dying, commanding while being secretly abandoned, represents the ultimate cost of a system that places divine authority in mortal hands. You observe how she develops new forms of performance designed to demonstrate continued vitality while privately preparing for the eventual acknowledgement of human limitation. The international implications of Elizabeth's visible decline begin to affect England's diplomatic position as foreign courts adjust their calculations based on anticipated changes in English policy. Treaties and alliances that depend on personal relationships with Elizabeth face uncertain futures, while potential enemies calculate whether England's period of transition might provide opportunities for aggressive action. The daily management of royal business becomes increasingly challenging as Elizabeth's cognitive abilities show signs of deterioration. Documents require multiple explanations, decisions are revisited repeatedly, and the kind of quick political calculation that once characterized her governance becomes more difficult and unreliable. Her secretaries develop tactful methods for ensuring that important business proceeds despite royal confusion, while maintaining the fiction that all decisions reflect the Queen's clear judgment. The relationship with Robert Dudley's memory becomes increasingly important to Elizabeth as other connections from her past fade or disappoint. At her death in 1603, Robert Dudley's last letter, written to her 6 days before his own death in September 1588, was found in a small casket by her bed. This preservation of their final correspondence reveals the depth of emotional attachment that has sustained Elizabeth through decades of political performance, providing private comfort that balances the public demands of royal service. The practical questions of royal healthcare become matters of state security as Elizabeth's physicians struggle to treat conditions that cannot be publicly acknowledged. The lead poisoning that has created her iconic appearance also causes symptoms that must be concealed to prevent political panic. Treatment options are limited by the need to maintain the daily makeup ritual that has become essential to royal authority, creating medical challenges that have no precedent in royal history. The economic implications of an aging monarch begin to affect royal finances as the costs of maintaining Elizabeth's elaborate daily performances increase, while her ability to generate revenue through personal appearances and diplomatic negotiations declines. The expenses associated with concealing royal infirmity, specialized cosmetics, medical consultations, increased security, strain budgets that must also prepare for the costly ceremonies that will accompany her eventual death and replacement. As 1602 progresses toward its end, you witness Elizabeth's growing awareness that she is living through the final chapter of her extraordinary reign. The woman who has successfully performed the role of immortal sovereign for more than 4 decades must now prepare for the ultimate performance, dying with sufficient dignity to preserve the mystique of monarchy while ensuring the smooth transition that England's stability requires. The winter deepens, and with it the shadows that surround the court of an aging queen whose reign has defined an era, but whose mortality threatens to destabilize everything she has built. The stage is set for the final act of the greatest performance in English royal history as Elizabeth prepares to transform even her death into a service to the crown that has consumed her entire adult life. The early months of 1603 bring an acceleration of decline that can no longer be concealed through cosmetics and performance. You find yourself at Richmond Palace in February, observing how Elizabeth had moved to Richmond Palace. A visiting Venetian ambassador noted how Elizabeth was covered in pearls, creating an image of magnificent defiance against the encroaching reality of mortality. The pearls, symbols of purity and immortality, now serve as armor against acknowledgement of human limitation, their luminous perfection contrasting starkly with the increasing fragility of the woman who wears them. The encounter with the Venetian ambassador reveals Elizabeth's determination to maintain royal dignity even as her physical capabilities deteriorate. Their terse exchange regarding English piracy was reminiscent of the quick-witted and sharp tongue of Elizabeth, who chastised the Republic of Venice for only ever asking for something. She even played the female card, asking if my sex has brought me this demerit. This flash of the old Elizabeth, witty, defiant, politically astute, provides a glimpse of the formidable intelligence that remains trapped within an increasingly unreliable body. She was showing no signs of ill health, despite clearly looking old. Her once slender hands, however, were swollen, and a few days later the coronation ring had to be cut off. The removal of the coronation ring represents far more than a medical necessity. It symbolizes the severing of the mystical bond between monarch and realm that has defined Elizabeth's understanding of her role for 45 years. As a symbol of her marriage to the kingdom, this was seen as a bad omen. Her reign was coming to an end. The anniversary of Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex's execution on February 25th, triggers a psychological crisis that reveals the depth of Elizabeth's private guilt and regret. The anniversary of Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex's execution on 25th of February, saw Elizabeth retreat to her private chambers away from court for a few days. When she emerged, she was melancholy and rambling, which convinced Cecil that she had some strange vapors to her brain. This retreat marks the beginning of Elizabeth's final withdrawal from the public performance that has defined her reign. You observe how the Queen's household adapts to this new phase of royal behavior, developing protocols for managing a monarch who can no longer reliably maintain the elaborate performances upon which her authority depends. Servants learn to interpret increasingly erratic commands. Courtiers master the art of meaningful conversations with someone whose attention span has become unpredictable, and physicians work desperately to treat symptoms that cannot be publicly acknowledged without undermining the entire structure of royal government. Her melancholy turned to anxiety as she suspected all around her of looking to her successor, whoever that may be. This paranoid awareness of her courtiers' inevitable preparations for transition creates additional psychological pressure that accelerates her decline. The woman who has spent her entire reign maintaining absolute control over every aspect of royal presentation now faces the ultimate loss of control as her own mortality becomes the determining factor in English politics. The physical symptoms of Elizabeth's final decline create daily crises that must be managed without acknowledging their significance. On the 9th March, she was described as eating little, and that her mouth and throat were dry and her chest hot. Elizabeth couldn't sleep and had spent the previous 3 days walking the gardens in summer clothes and refusing to rest. These behaviors suggest someone struggling against the acknowledgement of approaching death, fighting to maintain activity and independence even as her body fails. The image of the aging queen walking alone through winter gardens in inappropriate clothing provides a powerful metaphor for the isolation of absolute monarchy confronting mortality. You witness how her ladies follow at discreet distances, ready to provide assistance while respecting Elizabeth's determination to maintain independence. The gardens that once hosted elaborate entertainments and diplomatic conversations now serve as spaces for solitary contemplation of a life that has been entirely consumed by public service. At court, and further afield, thoughts were turning to what may happen at the moment of Elizabeth's death, which was surely close. the machinery of government begins operating in a strange, temporal suspension, continuing to serve a monarch who is visibly dying while secretly preparing for the transition that her death will trigger. Every decision must account for both present necessity and future consequences under a different ruler. For the Queen's Council, however, it was the prospect of a civil uprising from the poor which was the overriding concern. The Council convened at Richmond on the 15th of March and were in continuous session discussing how any potential revolution would be dealt with. This focus on domestic security reveals the extent to which Elizabeth's death represents not just dynastic transition but potential social upheaval. The economic hardships of the final years of her reign have created conditions that might explode into violence if the succession is not managed smoothly. The continuous session of the Privy Council at Richmond creates an atmosphere of crisis management that pervades the entire palace. You observe how normal routines are suspended as the government prepares for scenarios that cannot be publicly discussed. Military preparations proceed under cover of routine exercises, while communications are established with key regional authorities, who must be ready to maintain order during the vulnerable transition period. Elizabeth was not sleeping and was very weak. Her only noticeable physical symptom was a slight swelling on her glands under her jaw, which burst and reduced. By the 17th of March, still refusing to go to bed, Elizabeth was sitting on cushions on the floor of her bedchamber, her gaze fixed on the ground and a finger in her mouth. This image of the once magnificent Queen reduced to sitting on the floor represents the complete breakdown of the elaborate structures that have sustained royal dignity throughout her reign. The Queen's refusal to go to bed suggests a superstitious belief that horizontal position might hasten death, or perhaps simply the determination of someone who has spent her entire life performing strength to avoid any position that might suggest submission to weakness. You watch as her ladies maintain vigil around this heartbreaking tableau, providing what comfort they can while witnessing the dissolution of the most successful monarch in English history. She did not attend chapel the following day, remaining on her cushions from which she refused to move for a further 2 days and nights. Finally, on the evening of the 23rd March, she allowed herself to be lifted into bed. This transition from floor to bed marks Elizabeth's final surrender to the physical limitations that have increasingly constrained her ability to perform the role of immortal sovereign. The lifting itself requires careful coordination to maintain royal dignity while acknowledging human frailty. The question of succession, which Elizabeth has avoided throughout her reign, finally demands resolution as death approaches. She had not yet written a will, and therefore legally that of her father was still extant. That afternoon her counsellors went to her. They asked her to raise her finger at hearing the name of her favoured successor, for her throat was so sore and she was beyond speech. What happened next? It was James who would be reported as having been chosen by the Queen. This final political act, the designation of James VI of Scotland as her successor through a simple finger movement, represents the ultimate reduction of royal authority to its most basic elements. The woman who has spent decades crafting elaborate speeches and managing complex diplomatic negotiations must now communicate the most important decision of her reign through a gesture that cannot be questioned or interpreted differently by future historians. Once Elizabeth's last formal duty had been performed, the Archbishop of Canterbury, John Whitgift, and her other chaplains went to Elizabeth's bedside to pray with her. When they took their leave, she was left alone with her ladies, and it was with them that she died shortly before 2 a.m. on the 24th of March, 1603. The circumstances of Elizabeth's death, surrounded by women who have devoted their lives to maintaining the illusion of royal perfection, provide a fitting conclusion to a reign that has been defined by the collaborative creation of an extraordinary public persona. These ladies, who have spent decades applying toxic makeup, arranging elaborate costumes and supporting endless performances of royal dignity, now provide the final service of witnessing the peaceful end of the most demanding role in English history. In the silence that follows Elizabeth's last breath, you understand that an era has ended not just for England but for the entire concept of personal monarchy. The woman who has successfully embodied divine authority for 45 years has finally acknowledged human limitation, but her death represents triumph as much as tragedy. She has managed the ultimate royal performance, dying with sufficient dignity to preserve the mystique of monarchy while ensuring the peaceful transition that will allow her life's work to continue under new management. The Virgin Queen, who spent her entire adult life married to England, has finally been released from the exhausting demands of maintaining an impossible illusion. The boring repetition of daily ritual, the toxic transformation of woman into icon, the relentless performance of divine authority, all these have served their purpose in creating a reign that will define English national identity for centuries to come. Elizabeth Tudor dies as she has lived in service to a crown that has consumed everything she might have been in order to create something far greater than any individual life.